The night was bitterly cold, the kind that seeped through layers of clothing and clung to the skin like an unwelcome shadow. Snow flurries danced beneath the dim glow of streetlights as Sergeant Ethan Cole adjusted the grip on his firearm. The darkness of the city pressed in around him, a stark contrast to the adrenaline thrumming through his veins. The mission was supposed to be routine, a standard drug bust that he and his team had planned for weeks, but something in the air felt wrong, off, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Beside him, his partner, Shadow, moved with silent precision, ears twitching as he caught scents and sounds imperceptible to human senses. The German Shepherd had been with Ethan for years, more than just a K9 unit. He was family, a partner who had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Shadow's presence was an anchor, his steady gaze a silent reassurance that no matter what happened, they had each other's back. Ethan's radio crackled to life, breaking the eerie stillness. "Unit 4, do you have eyes on the target?" The voice of dispatch was calm, controlled, as if this were just another night on the job. Ethan pressed the button on his shoulder. "Negative." Moving into position, a low growl rumbled from Shadow's throat. Ethan glanced down, his pulse quickening. The dog rarely reacted unless something was wrong. A second later, a gunshot tore through the silence. Pain exploded in Ethan's chest, a searing heat that stole the breath from his lungs. The force of the bullet sent him staggering backward, his knees buckling as he collapsed onto the cold pavement. His vest had absorbed most of the impact, but the bullet had found flesh just below his ribs. Blood seeped into his uniform, warmth quickly fading against the icy ground. Shadow barked, a fierce, guttural sound that echoed off the alley walls. Ethan struggled to focus, to stay conscious, but the world around him blurred. His radio crackled again, voices calling his name, but he couldn't respond. His fingers trembled as he reached for his sidearm, but his strength was already fading. Shadow nudged him, whining, his intelligent eyes scanning Ethan's face before flickering to the darkness ahead. The dog understood. Help wasn't coming fast enough. If Ethan stayed here, he would bleed out alone in this alley. With one last glance at his handler, Shadow turned and bolted into the night. The German Shepherd ran like a ghost through the city streets, his powerful legs carrying him past dumpsters, leaping over fallen debris, weaving through alleyways without hesitation. The scent of Ethan's blood clung to his nose, but he pushed forward, instincts screaming that time was slipping away. He had only one thought: find help. Mark Reynolds had just stepped out of his patrol car, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulder. It had been a long shift, and he was ready to head back to the station when a sudden blur of movement caught his eye. A streak of black and tan hurtled toward him at full speed. Shadow. His voice was filled with confusion, but his instincts took over the moment the dog latched onto his sleeve, tugging hard. "Whoa, what's going on, boy?" Shadow barked once, urgent, his eyes locked onto Mark's. He tugged again, this time harder. It clicked. "Where's Ethan?" The only response was another sharp bark before Shadow turned and bolted. Mark didn't hesitate. He reached for his radio as he sprinted after the K9. "Officer down. I repeat, officer down. Shadow just found me. Send paramedics to my location now." The radio burst to life with voices confirming his call, but Mark didn't slow. He followed Shadow through the twisting maze of alleyways, his heart hammering as the air grew heavier, the distant scent of blood becoming unmistakable. Then he saw a dark alley, blood glistening under the faint light from a street lamp. Ethan lay motionless, his hand pressed weakly against his side, his face too pale. Mark's stomach lurched as he slid onto his knees beside his partner. "Ethan, stay with me, but..." Ethan's lips barely moved, his voice no more than a whisper. "Did he make it?" Mark swallowed hard. "Yeah, he made it. He brought me straight to you," Shadow whined, nosing at Ethan's cheek. A faint smile tugged at Ethan's lips before his eyes fluttered closed. "No, no, no, stay awake, damn it." Mark pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Help's coming. Just hold on." The distant wail of sirens grew louder, closing in fast. Shadow suddenly stiffened, ears pricked, his body coiled like a spring. His deep growl vibrated against the cold pavement. Mark's pulse spiked. Someone was coming. His hand went to his gun as he scanned the darkness. Had the shooter returned to finish the job, Footsteps. Shadow's growl deepened, his claws scraping against the pavement as he braced himself. A figure moved in the shadows. Mark held his breath, ready to fire. CPD. Lower your weapons. Mark exhaled sharply as the cavalry arrived. Officers swarmed the alley, guns drawn, eyes sharp. Paramedics rushed forward, their hands already moving to assess Ethan's condition. He's lost a lot of blood, Mark said quickly, stepping aside but keeping a firm grip on Shadow's collar. Bullet wound, lower left side. We've got him. One of the medics pressed a pressure bandage against Ethan's wound. Another inserted an IV, voice urgent as he called into the radio. Patient is critical but stable. Transporting now. Shadow whined as they lifted Ethan onto a stretcher. The dog tried to jump up after him, but Mark held him back. Easy boy, Mark murmured, running a hand over Shadow's fur. He's gonna be okay. Shadow didn't move. His gaze remained locked on Ethan, his body tense, his tail low. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The sirens screamed. As the vehicle disappeared into the night, Shadow let out a low, mournful whine. He had done his part. Now all he could do was wait. Mark knelt beside him, voice soft. You did good, boy. Better than good. Shadow blinked, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breath. But his eyes never left the direction the ambulance had gone. He wasn't just Ethan's partner. He was his protector, and he wasn't leaving his side. The sterile scent of antiseptic and medication filled the hospital corridors, a stark contrast to the freezing city streets Ethan had left behind. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale illumination over the polished floors as the medical team rushed through the emergency room doors, wheeling Ethan towards surgery. His breathing was weak, his skin ghostly pale, but he was still fighting. He always fought. Outside, in the waiting area, Shadow paced, his nails clicking against the tile floor, his ears flicking at every sound. He didn't understand why he wasn't allowed past the doors, why his handler had disappeared behind that bright white barrier. For years they had been together, through every call, every chase, every dangerous moment. Now, for the first time, they were separated. Mark Reynolds sat nearby, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, exhaustion settling deep in his bone. He had been through tough nights before, but this one felt different. This one had nearly cost him a brother. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, though the liquid inside had long since gone cold. His attention, however, never strayed from Shadow. The dog had not sat down since they arrived. Hey buddy, Mark murmured, reaching out to run a hand over Shadow's thick fur. I know. I don't like waiting either. Shadow let out a low whine, his head snapping up every time a nurse or doctor passed by. His keen brown eyes scanned their faces, searching for something, someone. But no one brought Ethan back. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock felt like a countdown neither of them could control. Finally, the doors swung open. A doctor approached, pulling down his mask. Sergeant Cole is out of surgery. Mark was on his feet in an instant. How is he? The doctor exhaled, glancing at the clipboard in his hands before looking back up. The bullet did significant damage. It tore through muscle, but thankfully it missed major organs. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable. The next 24 hours are critical, but if he makes it through that, his chances are good. Mark nodded, relief washing over him like a tide. Can we see him? The doctor hesitated, his gaze drifting toward Shadow. The dog stays. Mark frowned. Come on, Doc. You don't get it. Shadow won't leave until he sees Ethan. That's his partner. The doctor sighed. Fine, but keep him calm. If he causes any disruptions, he's out. Mark didn't have to say a word. The moment the door cracked open, Shadow darted through, nose to the air, following the familiar scent of his handler. The hospital room was dimly lit, the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the quiet. Ethan lay still, his face pale, an oxygen mask over his mouth, IV lines running from his arms. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. Too slow, too weak. Shadow jumped up onto the side of the hospital bed, resting his front paws near Ethan's arm. He sniffed carefully, then let out a deep, low whimper. Mark leaned against the doorway, watching. He's waiting for him to wake up. The doctor scribbled something onto his clipboard. That's a loyal dog you've got there. You have no idea, Mark muttered. Shadow didn't move. He just lowered his head onto Ethan's arm, his eyes never leaving his handler's face. The night dragged on, marked only by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Shadow remained unmoving, his breathing in sync with Ethan's shallow inhale. Mark dozed off in the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking him, but Shadow refused to sleep. Inside the darkness, Ethan drifted. It was like floating in an endless ocean. No sound, no light, just the weightless void of nothingness. He could hear distant voices, but they were muffled, distorted. He tried to reach for them, but his body wouldn't respond. Then something familiar, a sound, a whimper, low, deep. Shadow. Ethan tried to move, tried to fight against the weight, dragging him deeper, but it was like wading through thick fog. He was slipping, falling further, but the sound was getting louder, closer. Memories flashed. A younger Shadow, just a year old, his eager brown eyes staring up at him on their first day together. "We're gonna be the best damn team out there, buddy," Ethan had said, ruffling the pups for another memory. A dark street, just the two of them on patrol, Shadow trotting beside him, ever vigilant. The first time Shadow had saved his life tackling a suspect before the guy could stab Ethan in the back. Then the alley, the gunshot, the pain, the dark. A sharp whimper pulled him back. Ethan fought against the haze, struggling to surface. His body felt like it was made of lead, his limbs unresponsive, but he pushed through, clawing his way toward consciousness. Somewhere out in the real world, his fingers twitched. Shadow's ears shot up. Mark, half asleep in his chair, nearly dropped his coffee. Holy shit. The heart monitor's beeps changed rhythm. Shadow let out a sharp bark, his tail wagging slightly for the first time in hours. Mark was on his feet in an instant. "Ethan, hey, can you hear me?" Ethan's eyelids fluttered. His throat moved as he swallowed. His chest rose in a slow but steadier breath. Then finally his lips parted. One word, barely a whisper. "Shadow." Mark let out a breathless laugh, relief crashing through him. "Damn right it's Shadow. He never left your side." Shadow nudged Ethan's arm, licking his fingers, whining softly. Ethan's lips barely curled into the faintest smile. His voice was hoarse, weak. "Saved me. Again, huh, buddy?" Shadow licked his hand again. Mark smirked. "Yeah, and dragged my ass halfway across the city to do it." Ethan let out a weak chuckle. A fragile sound, but it was life. His gaze shifted to Shadow, and in that moment, no words were needed. The bond between them was unbreakable. Shadow had done the impossible. He had brought Ethan back. Ethan lay in the hospital bed, his body aching with every breath. But the pain was nothing compared to the realization of how close he had come to death. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still alive. Because of Shadow. The German Shepherd had not left his side since he'd woken up. Even now, as nurses moved in and out of the room, checking his vitals, adjusting his IV, Shadow remained perched beside him, his large paws resting on the edge of the bed, his dark eyes tracking every movement. The dog refused to be moved, even when a nurse gently tried to coax him away. He simply let out a low whine and pressed his head against Ethan's hand. "He's protective," the nurse said with an amused smile, adjusting the blanket over Ethan. "I don't think he's going anywhere." Ethan managed a weak chuckle, his throat still dry. "Yeah, he's stubborn like that." Mark, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, stretched his arms and leaned forward. "More like he's making sure you don't pull another near-death stunt." Ethan sighed, turning his head slightly. "I didn't exactly plan on getting shot, you know." Mark smirked. "Could have fooled me." Ethan's gaze drifted back to Shadow, who was still watching him, tail flicking slightly. "How bad was it?" Mark hesitated, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You lost a lot of blood." "If Shadow hadn't found me when he did," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Let's just say, I wouldn't be sitting here cracking jokes right now." Ethan let that sink in. He had been close, too close. The silence stretched between them, before Mark spoke again, his voice softer. He knew, Ethan, before the shot was even fired, he knew something was wrong. Ethan nodded slowly, swallowing hard. He'd felt it too, that split-second warning, that instinct that something was off, but Shadow had reacted faster. If only he had listened, if only he had trusted the dog's instincts immediately, maybe things would have played out differently. Mark watched his friend's expression darken. Don't do that. Do what? Blame yourself. Ethan exhaled sharply, staring at the ceiling. If I had been more careful, more aware. You were ambushed, Mark interrupted firmly. You didn't do anything wrong. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers idly running through Shadow's fur. Doesn't feel that way. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, I get it. You're a control freak. You think you should have seen it coming, that you should have done something different. But here's the reality, you didn't. And that's okay. You're human, Ethan. You got hit, but you survived. You survived because of him. He nodded toward Shadow. And instead of sitting here beating yourself up, maybe just be grateful that you have a partner who would do anything for you. Ethan looked at Shadow, who was still staring up at him, with those deep, intelligent eyes. A lump formed in his throat. Yeah, he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. I really owe you, buddy. Shadow let out a soft huff and leaned into his touch. The door swung open, and Captain James Holloway strode in. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his sharp blue eyes missed nothing as he took in the sight of his sergeant awake and alert. Well, Holloway said, folding his arms. Look who decided to stick around. Ethan smirked. Wasn't ready to hand in my badge just yet, sir. Holloway gave a gruff nod, stepping closer to the bed. Good, because we need you out there. His expression softened slightly. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, Ethan admitted. Close enough, Mark muttered. Holloway let out a short chuckle before his face turned serious. I read the report. The gang you were after, they weren't just running drugs. They were smuggling weapons. Illegal military-grade firearms. Ethan's stomach tightened. That explains why they were so prepared. Holloway nodded. We believe they were tipped off before the operation. They knew you were coming. Ethan's grip on Shadow's fur tightened. You think we have a leak? Holloway's silence was answer enough. Mark frowned. That's a hell of an accusation. We're looking into it, Holloway said. But until we know for sure, I need both of you to be careful. Ethan, you were a target. This wasn't just bad luck. Ethan's jaw clenched. He hated the idea that someone inside the force could have betrayed them. So what now? You focus on recovering, Holloway said firmly. Mark, you're on the investigation. I want you to go through every angle. Who knew about the operation? Who had access to the details? Mark nodded. On it. Holloway glanced at Shadow, his expression unreadable. And make sure you keep this one close, he added, nodding toward the dog. Seems like he's the only one who really sees things coming. Ethan smirked slightly. That's the plan, sir. Holloway gave him one last nod before turning on his heel and exiting the room. The air felt heavier after he left. Mark let out a low whistle. A leak inside the department. That's bad news. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, and if someone set me up once, they'll do it again. Silence hung between them, filled only by the faint hum of hospital equipment. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching. Ethan ran a hand over the dog's back, exhaling slowly. Well, boy, looks like we've got work to do. Shadow gave a low, determined woof. Mark shook his head with a smirk. You just got out of surgery and you're already planning your next move. Ethan smirked back. You know me. Yeah, I do, Mark muttered. And that's what worries me. But there was no stopping it now. Ethan had nearly lost everything, and he wasn't about to let it happen again. The hospital walls felt like they were closing in. The steady beep of the monitors, the sterile smell of antiseptics, the quiet murmurs of passing nurses. It was suffocating. Ethan had never been the type to sit still for too long, and the longer he lay in that bed, the more restless he became. Shadow, however, remained a constant, unmoving presence beside him. The German shepherd's body was rigid with attention, his sharp eyes scanning every movement in the room, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. He knew something was still wrong. He could sense it. Mark had left an hour ago, off to dig into the lead Holloway had given them about the possibility of a leak in the department. That was the part that unsettled Ethan the most. The idea that someone he worked with, someone he trusted, had set him up. And if they had once, they would again. The door to his room creaked open, and he instinctively tensed, his hand twitching toward where his holster should have been. But it was just a nurse, Emma, the one who had been tending to him since his first night here. She offered a soft smile, but her eyes flicked to Shadow warily. "Still won't leave your side?" she asked, as she moved toward his IV. Ethan smirked slightly. "Wouldn't be the first time." She shook her head in amusement, adjusting the drip. "You know, I've seen a lot of K9 officers come through here, but I've never seen a bond like this." Ethan glanced at Shadow, his fingers brushing over the dog's thick fur. "He's more than just a partner." Emma nodded. "I can see that." Just then, the door creaked open again, but this time it wasn't a nurse. Holloway stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Ethan immediately knew something was wrong. Shadow's body went rigid, his ears pinning back slightly, as he let out a low rumbling growl, not in aggression, but in warning. Ethan pushed himself up on the bed. "Talk to me, Cap." Holloway shut the door behind him and pulled a chair closer to the bed, lowering his voice. "We found something." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "A leak?" Holloway nodded. "Mark's digging deeper, but from what we've pieced together so far, there was definitely inside information being fed to the gang. Someone in the department had to have tipped them off." Ethan exhaled sharply, clenching his jaw. "Any idea who?" Holloway hesitated, which only made Ethan's gut tighten further. "We're still working on that," he admitted, "but here's where things get worse." Ethan tilted his head slightly, waiting. Holloway met his gaze. "We intercepted a call earlier today. The gang isn't finished, Ethan. They're still after you." Silence. The weight of the words settled over him like a thick fog. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice calmer than he felt. "I'm out of commission. I'm no threat to them right now." Holloway's expression darkened. "Because they think you know something important. And if there really is a leak in the department, they could have access to your records. They could know where you are." Ethan's heart rate picked up, but not from fear for himself at least. His mind immediately jumped to Shadow. If they were willing to go after him, would they go after his partner too? Shadow let out another quiet growl, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. Holloway straightened. "I'm moving you. You can't stay here." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Where?" "I've arranged for private transport," Holloway said. "You'll be transferred to an off-site medical facility, somewhere secure until we sort this out." Ethan shook his head. "No." Holloway frowned. "That wasn't a suggestion, Sergeant." "I'm not running," Ethan said firmly. "If they're coming for me, I'm not going to be sitting in a hospital bed waiting for them to find me." Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ethan, you just got out of surgery. Then clear me." Holloway gave him a pointed look. "That's not how it works." Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to calm down. "Then let me go home. At least there I know the surroundings. I know the exits. I can defend myself if I have to." Shadow let out a short approving bark. Holloway sighed again, shaking his head. "You really are a stubborn bastard." Ethan smirked slightly. "That's why you like me." Holloway muttered something under his breath, before standing. "I'll talk to your doctor, but if you're leaving, you're not going alone. I'll have a unit stationed outside your place until we know more." Ethan nodded. "Fair enough." Holloway took one last glance at Shadow. "Keep your eyes open, both of you." With that, he left. Ethan sat back, exhaling through his nose. His ribs ached, his head pounded, but none of that mattered. Because if Holloway was right, if the gang really was coming for him, then he had to be ready. Shadow pressed his nose against Ethan's arm, letting out a soft whine. Ethan ran a hand over the dog's head, his fingers pressing into the familiar warmth of his fur. "Looks like we're not done yet, buddy." Shadow's tail thumped against the bed, his eyes burning with silent understanding. No, they were far from done. The sun was setting by the time Ethan left the hospital, a golden hue stretching across the city skyline. It should have felt peaceful, but there was no peace in his chest, only the steady thrum of tension, like a predator waiting to strike. His body was still sore, his stitches pulling with every movement, but he forced himself to ignore it. There were bigger problems to deal with. Shadow walked close to his side. As they exited through the back of the hospital, his tail low, his ears flicking at every sound. The dog was on edge. He knew something was wrong. Mark was waiting by an unmarked SUV, leaning against the hood, arms crossed. His face was unreadable, but Ethan knew that look. "You're pissed," Ethan muttered, as he approached. Mark let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. I'm not pissed. I'm just wondering how the hell you convinced Holloway to let you walk out of there. Ethan smirked, opening the back door for Shadow to jump in before climbing into the passenger seat himself. You know me, I'm persuasive. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a low rumble. More like stubborn as hell. Ethan exhaled through his nose, resting his head against the seat. Any updates? Mark's expression darkened as he pulled onto the road. Yeah, and you're not gonna like it. Ethan glanced at him. Try me. The gang isn't just coming after you. They're watching everyone close to you. Your name's been passed around like a damn target. And the worst part? We still don't know who in the department is leaking information. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching against his leg. So what? They're hoping I'll lead them to something? Mark nodded. That's the theory. They think you know more than you actually do. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. Great, so they'll just keep coming. Mark shot him a sideways glance. That's why Holloway wanted you somewhere safe. You being out in the open, it's bait. You know that, right? Ethan looked out the window, watching the city blur past. Yeah, he muttered. Silence stretched between them for a while, the only sound the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Mark finally sighed, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I get it, man. I do. You don't want to feel helpless, but walking into a trap isn't the way to fix that. Ethan glanced at Shadow in the back seat. The dog's head was resting on his paws, but his eyes remained locked onto Ethan's reflection in the mirror, as if he too was waiting for an answer. Finally, Ethan exhaled and sat up a little straighter. Then we set the trap first. Mark groaned. I knew you were gonna say that. Ethan smirked. Come on. You wouldn't have it any other way. Mark muttered something under his breath, before shaking his head. Fine, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you. Wouldn't expect anything less. They drove in silence after that, heading toward Ethan's home, a modest 2-story house on the edge of the city. It was quiet, tucked away from the chaos of downtown, which made it perfect for what they were planning. As they pulled into the driveway, Shadow was the first to react. His ears snapped up, his posture stiffening. Then, a low growl rumbled from his throat. Ethan's body went rigid. Mark immediately shut off the engine. You hear that? Ethan nodded, already reaching for the door handle. Stay close. Shadow leapt out first, his movements precise, controlled. He stalked forward, sniffing the air, his tail stiff like a warning flag. Ethan and Mark followed, keeping low, their eyes scanning the perimeter of the house. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But Shadow didn't relax. Ethan took a slow breath and moved toward the door, his keys clutched in his hand. That's when he saw it. A single mark carved into the wood, deep, deliberate. It wasn't random. It was a symbol. Mark cursed under his breath. That's gang-related. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, it means they've been here. His grip on the keys tightened. He had expected them to come for him, but he hadn't expected them to get this close so fast. Shadow let out another low growl, his body shifting slightly toward the house. Ethan exchanged a glance with Mark. Then, without a word, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air inside the house was still too still. The kind of silence that didn't feel natural. Ethan stepped inside first, his muscles tense, his heartbeat steady but alert. Shadow followed immediately, his paws barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. The dog's body was rigid, his ears pricked forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Mark was right behind them, his hand resting on his holster. Something's off, he muttered. Ethan nodded. He could feel it too. The house looked the same, but there was something unnatural about the way it felt. Like someone had been here. Like the walls were holding on to something unseen. Shadow padded forward, his movements careful, methodical. His nose hovered just above the floor as he followed an invisible trail. Ethan's eyes flickered across the living room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Mark moved toward the hallway, checking the corners as he went. Doesn't look like anything's been taken, he said. Doesn't mean they didn't leave something behind, Ethan murmured. Shadow suddenly let out a low, deep growl. Ethan's spine stiffened. Shadow's entire body was coiled, his hackles raised. He wasn't just growling, he was warning. Mark tensed, reaching for his gun. What is it? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he followed Shadow's gaze straight to the kitchen. The dog was locked onto something beyond the doorway, his entire body tense with anticipation. Ethan exchanged a glance with Mark before stepping forward. The kitchen was empty, or at least it looked that way. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting a faint glow over the counters. Then Ethan saw it. A single envelope on the kitchen table. His name was written on the front. His blood ran cold. Mark cursed under his breath. "Tell me that wasn't there when you left." Ethan stepped closer, his fingers twitching as he reached for it. The paper felt thin beneath his touch, but heavy in its own way, a threat disguised as something delicate. Shadow let out another quiet growl, staying close. Ethan carefully opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the single slip of paper inside. 4 words. "You should have stayed." The letters were printed neatly. No smudges, no mistakes, just a simple chilling message. Mark exhaled sharply. "That's a warning." Ethan clenched his jaw, folding the paper tightly in his fist. "No," he muttered. "That's a challenge." Shadow barked once, loud and sharp. Ethan glanced down at the dog. Shadow wasn't just alert, he was agitated. He knew what this meant. Someone had been in their home. Someone had been close enough to leave this message without leaving a trace. Mark ran a hand over his face. "All right, we need to be smart about this. If they're watching you, then we have to assume they know your movements." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then we turn the game on." Mark raised a brow. "You want to bait them?" Ethan nodded. "They want me paranoid. They want me to hesitate. But I'm not playing their game." Mark hesitated for a moment, before sighing. "All right, what's the plan?" Ethan's gaze flickered toward Shadow. The dog was still staring at the doorway, his body tight with anticipation, his eyes sharp. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Ethan smirked slightly. "We let them think they're in control." Mark scoffed. "That's insane." Ethan turned back to the letter, his grip tightening. "Yeah, but so am I." Shadow barked again, as if in agreement. Mark let out a dry laugh. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we do it right." Ethan met his gaze. "Then let's get started." Ethan sat in the dimly lit living room, the letter still clenched in his fist. The weight of the message pressed against him, but not in the way the sender intended. They wanted him to feel fear, uncertainty, to second-guess his every move. But all it did was fuel the fire already burning inside him. Shadow sat at his feet, his body tense, his amber eyes locked onto the door like he expected someone to walk through it any second. He was waiting, watching. The dog wasn't just alert. He was ready for whatever came next. Mark paced near the window, peering through the curtains into the darkness outside. "We don't know how many people we're dealing with." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter," Mark scoffed. "Of course it matters. We're walking straight into a setup here, Ethan." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They don't know that we know." Mark turned, frowning. "You sure about that?" Ethan's fingers tapped against his knee. "Yeah. If they knew, they wouldn't have left a message. They would have acted." Mark was quiet for a moment before sighing. "All right, then what's your move?" Ethan's eyes flicked toward Shadow. The dog's ears twitched, still focused on the door. "Still waiting." "They're expecting me to react," Ethan said. "They think I'll be paranoid, that I'll go into hiding or start looking over my shoulder." Mark crossed his arms. "So instead, we act normal?" Ethan nodded. "We act like I don't know anything. We stick to my usual routine. Let them get comfortable watching me. Then we make our move." Mark exhaled sharply. "This is reckless." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, but so is waiting for them to come knocking again." Mark didn't argue this time. Shadow let out a quiet huff, his tail twitching slightly. Ethan reached down, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. "You ready, boy?" Shadow's ears perked, his body shifting slightly forward. He was always ready. Mark shook his head. "Fine. If we're doing this, we need backup. Holloway needs to know." Ethan nodded. "Tell him we're keeping eyes on the situation." "That's..." Mark hesitated before finally pulling out his phone. "I hope you know what you're doing." Ethan's smirk faded slightly as he stared down at the crumpled note in his hands. "So do I." The next morning, Ethan went about his routine as if nothing had happened. He walked Shadow like he always did, took the usual route, stopping at the same coffee shop on the way home. Every move was calculated, deliberate, and the whole time he knew someone was watching. Shadow sensed it too. He was alert, more than usual, his head turning at every small noise, his body tensing whenever they passed a parked car or a shadowed alley. Ethan didn't change his pace, didn't look around, didn't give any indication that he knew they were there. But he knew, and that meant he had control. Back at the house, Mark was already waiting. He had positioned himself across the street in an unmarked car, watching for movement, keeping track of any unfamiliar vehicles that lingered too long. As Ethan stepped inside, he glanced down at Shadow. The dog's ears twitched. He was still on edge. "They followed you?" Mark asked from the window. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, not close, but enough." Mark muttered a curse. "They're getting bolder." "Good," Ethan said, shrugging off his jacket. "Let them." Mark shot him a look. "You say that like it's a good thing." "It is," Ethan said simply. "Because if they get too comfortable, they'll make a mistake." Shadow padded closer, nudging Ethan's hand with his nose. A silent understanding passed between them. The dog knew this wasn't over. Mark exhaled sharply. "So, what's the next step?" Ethan smirked, glancing down at the dog beside him. "Now," he murmured. "Now we will." Ethan sat in his living room, his fingers tapping against the wooden coffee table in rhythmic beats. He wasn't used to waiting. He was a man of action. But in this game, patience was the weapon. Shadow sat at his feet, ears flicking at the occasional sound outside. The dog was on edge, sensing the tension in the air. Mark, still stationed by the window, let out a long exhale. "I hate this." Ethan smirked. "You hate waiting?" Mark shook his head. "No, I hate that I know you're about to do something reckless." Ethan chuckled but didn't deny it. His fingers brushed against the crumpled note, still sitting on the table. The message was clear. You should have stayed. Whoever had left it was watching, waiting for him to react. "Fine. Let them wait." Mark shifted. "They're getting comfortable." Ethan nodded. "That's the point." Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. Porch lights flickered on as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Everything looked normal. But Ethan knew better. "They won't make their move until they think we've let our guard down," he murmured. Mark scoffed. "And you think they're dumb enough to fall for that?" Ethan glanced down at Shadow. The dog's nose twitched slightly, as if he was already one step ahead of them. "They don't think I have the upper hand," Ethan said. "They don't know Shadow is watching them too." Shadow let out a low huff, his tail flicking once. Mark exhaled sharply. "This is insane." Ethan smirked. "It's working." Then, as if on cue, Shadow's ears perked. His body stiffened, his amber eyes locked on the front door. Ethan felt it too. The shift, the change in the air. Someone was here. Mark's hand moved instinctively to his holster. Shadow let out a deep, warning growl. Ethan slowly stood. Then, a knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. Ethan and Mark exchanged a glance. Shadow's growl grew deeper. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders back before stepping forward. His fingers hovered over the doorknob for a second, his pulse steady. Then, with one smooth motion, he swung the door open, and there, standing on the porch, was a man Ethan hadn't seen in years. A man he thought was dead. Mark cursed under his breath. Ethan just stared. "Well," the man said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Shadow didn't move. His body remained tense, his growl low and vibrating through the floorboards. Ethan's jaw tightened. Because this changed everything. Ethan's grip on the door tightened. His breath stayed even, but his mind was already processing 1,000 different scenarios. The man standing in front of him was someone he had buried in his past. Someone who was supposed to be dead. Shadow's growl deepened, his hackles raised. He didn't trust the man, and neither did Ethan. Mark was the first to break the silence. "You've got to be kidding me." The man smirked, tilting his head slightly. "No hello? No good to see you?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I watched you die." The man's smirk didn't falter. "Well, I guess you didn't watch closely enough." Ethan studied him, looking for any sign of deception. He looked the same, older, maybe a few more scars, but the same piercing stare that had once belonged to a friend. Or at least someone Ethan had thought was a friend. Mark's fingers hovered near his holster. You better start talking or this conversation ends real fast. The man lifted his hands in mock surrender. Easy, boys. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to warn you. Ethan exhaled slowly. Warn me about what? The man's smirk faded, his expression growing serious. You're in deeper than you think. Ethan crossed his arms. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. The man shook his head. No, you don't. You think this is about some gang looking for revenge. But it's bigger than that. Mark narrowed his eyes. What the hell does that mean? The man glanced past them, into the house. His gaze landed on Shadow, who still hadn't moved an inch. The dog's eyes locked onto him like a hunter tracking prey. That dog, the man muttered. He's the reason you're still alive. Ethan's expression didn't change. And then, the man exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. They're not just watching you. They're watching him too. Ethan felt a flicker of unease. He had been prepared for a war against the people who had left that note in his house. But this was something different. Mark shifted. Who is they? The man hesitated. You're not ready for that answer. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. Try me. The man sighed. Look, I came here because I owe you. I can't stay long, but you need to understand. This isn't about you anymore. It's about what Shadow knows. Ethan's pulse quickened. Shadow? What could a dog possibly know that made him a target? Shadow let out another low growl, his body shifting slightly. He didn't like this conversation. The man took a step back. They won't come at you directly. They'll wait. They'll push you into a corner until you have nowhere left to go. Ethan's jaw tight. Then I'll make sure they don't get the chance. The man's eyes darkened. You don't understand, Ethan. They always get their chance. Ethan didn't blink. Not this time. For a moment, the man just stared at him. Then finally he nodded. Maybe, but if you're going to fight them, don't do it alone. Ethan glanced at Mark, then down at Shadow. The dog's body was still tense, but his gaze never wavered. Ethan exhaled. I never do. The man hesitated one last time, then turned to leave. Mark waited until he disappeared down the street before exhaling sharply. Okay, what the hell was that? Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at Shadow, who finally broke his stance and let out a soft huff. Something about this didn't sit right, because if what the man had said was true, then Ethan wasn't the only target anymore. Shadow was too. Ethan stood in the doorway long after the man had disappeared down the street. The air was cold, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Mark was the first to break the silence. We have a serious problem. Ethan exhaled sharply. Yeah, I noticed. Shadow finally relaxed, stepping forward and nudging Ethan's hand. His body was still alert, but his tail flicked slightly, as if waiting for Ethan's next move. The dog could feel the tension in the air, just as much as the two men could. Mark shook his head. What the hell did he mean? They're watching Shadow too. Ethan had been replaying that sentence in his mind over and over again. Shadow was a dog. Smart, well-trained, but just a dog. Wasn't he? A flicker of a memory surfaced. Shadow finding that envelope before Ethan even noticed it. The way the dog had been uneasy for days, sensing something before anyone else did. Ethan tightened his grip on the doorframe. Mark ran a hand over his face. We're not just dealing with a hit. This is bigger. That guy wasn't lying. Ethan closed the door with a quiet click and turned to face him. Then we find out who they are before they find out what we know. Mark huffed a dry laugh. You say that like it's gonna be easy. Ethan smirked. I don't expect it to be easy. I expect it to be messy. Shadow let out a quiet huff, tail twitching. Mark shook his head. All right, so what's the next move? Ethan glanced at the crumpled letter still sitting on the table, then back at Shadow. The dog's amber eyes locked onto him, a silent exchange of understanding. We go on the offensive, Ethan said finally. No more waiting. We turn the game on them. Mark raised a brow. And how exactly do we do that? Ethan smirked. We make them think they are the ones being hunted. Mark let out a slow breath. You're insane. Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder. And yet, here you are. Mark sighed. Yeah, let's get to work. Shadow wagged his tail once, his body finally relaxing. Not because the danger was over, because he knew Ethan was ready. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. But this time they weren't the prey. They were the predators. And whoever was out there watching, they were about to realize they had underestimated the wrong man and his dog. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled note in his hands. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, heavier than before. The man from his past had resurfaced, delivering a warning that changed everything. Shadow isn't just a dog to them. He's a threat. Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, what's the play? Ethan exhaled, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. We stop reacting. We stop waiting. We take control. Mark scoffed. That's cute, but we don't even know who we're dealing with. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who was sitting at his feet, watching him closely. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence beyond instinct. He had been warning Ethan from the start, sensing something neither of them had put together, until now. Ethan leaned forward. I have a plan. Mark frowned. Of course you do. Ethan slid a burner phone across the table. We're going to make them think they've won. Mark picked up the phone, flipping it over in his hand. You want to fake your own failure? Ethan nodded. They expect me to come at them head on. Instead, we're going to make it look like they got to me first. Mark exhaled, shaking his head. This is reckless. Ethan smirked. That's why it'll work. Shadow let out a soft huff, shifting his paws as if ready to move. Mark ran a hand through his hair. All right, let's hear it. Ethan pushed away from the table, grabbing his jacket. First, we leak some intel, something convincing enough to draw them out. Then we let them think they have an advantage. Mark narrowed his eyes. And where do you plan to do this? Ethan's smirk wide. Somewhere they feel safe. An hour later, Ethan and Mark sat in an unmarked car, parked just outside an old warehouse on the edge of the city. It was the perfect location, abandoned, isolated, and the kind of place where people made threats without expecting a response. Mark adjusted his earpiece. Are you sure about this? Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Not even a little. Shadow sat in the back seat, his gaze locked on the entrance of the warehouse. He was more than ready. Mark sighed. All right, let's do this. Ethan grabbed the burner phone and dialed a number. It rang once before a voice picked up. You're making a mistake, Ethan said. Silence. Then a low chuckle. You should have left well enough alone, Ethan. Ethan smirked. Yeah, but that's not really my style. A pause. Then where are you? Ethan glanced at Mark. Hooked. I want to make a deal, Ethan said. No cops. Just you and me. Another pause. Then warehouse. 30 minutes. The line went dead. Mark muttered a curse. You just walked into a trap. Ethan grinned. Exactly. Shadow let out a quiet growl, his body tense with anticipation. Ethan turned to him. Ready, boy? Shadow's tail flicked once. 30 minutes later, Ethan stepped into the warehouse. The air smelled of rust and damp concrete. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows. Footsteps echoed. Then, a group of men emerged from the darkness, their leader stepping forward. Ethan recognized him immediately. Victor Holloway, Mark's former captain, the man who had supposedly left the force years ago. Ethan smirked. You always had a thing for dramatics, didn't you? Victor tilted his head. You always had a problem with authority. Ethan shrugged. Not my fault you weren't worth respecting. Victor's smirk faltered. You should have stayed quiet. Ethan's eyes flicked to the side. One of Victor's men had a radio. They weren't alone. Let's cut to it, Ethan said. You want Shadow? Victor exhaled. That dog has information we need. Ethan's jaw tightened. He's a dog. Victor's smirk returned. You don't get it, do you? He took a step closer. Shadow was trained for more than just protection. He was part of a classified program, and the last thing he saw before his former handler died. It wasn't just a random accident. He knows where something valuable is hidden. And you're just in the way. Ethan clenched his fists. So you killed his handler. Victor's expression didn't change. Some people are expendable. Ethan's pulse spiked, but he forced himself to stay calm. Victor sighed. Last chance, Ethan. Walk away, and we'll pretend this never happened. Ethan smirked. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. Victor's eyes narrowed. You really think you can take all of us? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he whistled. The warehouse doors slammed open. Shadow came tearing through like a bullet, his growl echoing through the space, and behind him, Mark and a full team of officers. Victor's expression barely had time to shift before chaos erupted. Shadow lunged, taking down one of the men in seconds. Mark fired a warning shot, sending the others scrambling. Victor turned to run, but Ethan was faster. He grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a rusted metal beam. "You were right about one thing," Ethan growled. "Shadow does know things." Victor struggled. "This isn't over." Ethan cut him off by slamming him against the beam again. "No, but you are." Victor's eyes flicked toward Shadow, who stood at Ethan's side, his teeth bare. The sound of sirens filled the air. Victor's men were already on the ground, restrained by officers. Mark smirked. "Guess you should have stayed retired." Victor glared but said nothing. As he was hauled away, Ethan knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You did good, boy." Shadow let out a soft huff, tail wagging once. Mark clapped Ethan on the back. "You're insane." Ethan grinned. "And yet, here you are." Mark sighed. Yeah, let's go home." Ethan exhaled, glancing down at Shadow. "Yeah, home." Shadow nudged his leg, as if he understood. For the first time in weeks, the fight was over, and they had won.